Hey, what's going on, everyone? Welcome back to the channel, and today we're diving deep into one of those action thrillers that genuinely kept people on the edge of their seats back in 2007. We're talking about Shooter, directed by Antoine Fuqua, starring Mark Wahlberg in what many fans consider one of his best performances. Now, if you haven't seen this film yet, first of all, where have you been? And second of all, you're in for a real treat because we're going to break down absolutely everything about this movie today. And if you have seen it, stick around because we're going to go through details you might have missed, analyze the story from every angle, talk about the cast, the production, the themes, and so much more. So let's get into it. The basic premise of Shooter is actually pretty straightforward on the surface, but once you peel back the layers, it becomes something a lot more complex and interesting. The story follows Bob Lee Swagger, a former Marine Scout sniper who is widely considered one of the best long-range shooters in the entire world. He's retired, living off the grid in the mountains of Wyoming with his dog, just trying to leave his past behind him. But as we all know, in movies like this, the past never really stays in the past. Swagger is approached by a mysterious group led by a man named Colonel Isaac Johnson, who tells him that there's a credible threat against the President of the United States. They need his expertise to help figure out how a potential shooter might set up a long-range attack during a presidential visit, so they can supposedly prevent it. Swagger, being the patriotic and duty-driven man that he is, agrees to help. And that's where things go completely sideways, because it turns out the whole thing is a setup. The real plan was never to stop an attack on the president. Instead, Swagger is framed for an attempt that goes wrong in an unexpected way, and suddenly this highly skilled, highly trained former soldier finds himself on the run, wanted by every law enforcement agency in the country, trying to clear his name while uncovering a massive conspiracy that goes all the way to the top levels of power in Washington. So yeah, when we say the premise is layered, we mean it. Now let's talk about who populates this world, because Shooter has a genuinely solid cast of characters that make the story work. At the center of everything is Bob Lee Swagger himself, played by Mark Wahlberg. Swagger is the kind of character that Hollywood used to make all the time and doesn't quite make in the same way anymore. He's competent, he's disciplined, he's resourceful, and he has an incredibly strong moral compass even when the world around him is completely corrupt. He's not a superhero. He gets hurt, he makes mistakes, he struggles, but he keeps pushing forward because he knows what's right, and he refuses to let the people who wronged him get away with it. Wahlberg brings a real physicality and intensity to the role that works incredibly well. He did a lot of preparation for the part, learning about long-range shooting, understanding how snipers operate, studying the mindset of someone who has spent years being the best at an extraordinarily specialized skill. And it shows in how he carries himself throughout the film. There's a confidence and a precision to the way Swagger moves and thinks that feels earned rather than just performed. Then we have Nick Memphis, played by Michael Pena, who at the time was still building his profile as a leading supporting actor in Hollywood. Nick is a young FBI agent who is basically the opposite of Swagger in almost every way. He's inexperienced, he's a bit awkward, he doesn't have Swagger's battle-tested calm, and he's definitely not a physical specimen in the way that our main character is. But what Nick has is a genuine moral compass and a willingness to follow the truth wherever it leads, even when that truth is terrifying and career-ending. Nick is the one who starts to question whether Swagger is actually guilty of what he's accused of, and his journey in the film is about growing from a somewhat green agent into someone who understands that the system he works for is not always on the right side of things. Michael Peña is fantastic in this role, providing some genuine moments of humor and warmth that balance out the heavier elements of the story without ever feeling out of place. Kate Mara appears in the film as Sarah Fenn, the widow of Swagger's partner, who was lost during an operation years before the main events of the movie. Sarah becomes important to the story because Swagger reaches out to her when he's on the run and needs help. There's a dynamic between them that's built on shared grief and mutual respect, and Kate Mara handles the role with a quiet strength that makes Sarah feel like a real person, rather than just a plot device. Her character represents what Swagger lost, and what he's still fighting to protect, even years after the fact. Danny Glover plays Colonel Isaac Johnson, the primary antagonist of the film, and he is absolutely compelling in the role. Johnson is not a cartoonish villain who twirls his mustache and announces his evil plans. He's a man who has operated in the shadows for a long time, who genuinely believes that what he's doing serves some greater purpose, or at least has convinced himself of that. Glover brings a cool, measured menace to the character that makes him genuinely unsettling in a way that loud, explosive villains never quite achieve. Every scene he's in, there's this sense that he's always 3 steps ahead, always calculating, always considering every angle. He's the kind of villain you actually find yourself respecting, even as you despise what he represents. Ned Beatty plays Senator Charles F. Meacham, a powerful political figure who is connected to the conspiracy at the heart of the film. Beatty plays him with a southern charm and a folksy warmth that makes his villainy all the more disturbing, because he seems like someone's friendly grandfather right up until the moment you realize exactly who he is and what he's capable of. It's one of those performances where the pleasantness of the exterior makes the interior all the more chilling. Beatty is a veteran actor with an incredible range, and he uses every bit of it here. Elias Koteas shows up as Agent James Payne, who serves as one of the more active antagonists pursuing Swagger throughout the film. Koteas has always been excellent at playing characters with a certain kind of menace lurking beneath the surface, and Payne is no exception. He's dangerous, he's relentless, and he has the authority of government backing him up, which makes him a particularly effective obstacle for our hero to deal with. And then there's Rade Šerbedžija, the veteran Serbian actor who brings tremendous gravitas to every role he takes, appearing here as a character connected to the wider conspiracy. His presence in the film adds an international dimension to the story and serves as a reminder that the kind of corruption Swagger is fighting against doesn't respect national borders. The direction comes from Antoine Fuqua, who by 2007 was already well established as one of Hollywood's most capable action directors. Fuqua had made his name with Training Day in 2001, which won Denzel Washington his second Academy Award and announced Fuqua as a filmmaker with serious chops. He followed that with films like Tears of the Sun and King Arthur, continuing to demonstrate his ability to handle large-scale action sequences while also finding the human drama within them. Shooter gave Fuqua another opportunity to work in a space he clearly loves, which is the intersection of explosive physical action and morally complex storytelling. He brings an energy and urgency to the film that keeps things moving even when the plot is doing a lot of heavy lifting in terms of exposition and setup. The screenplay was written by Jonathan Lemkin, who adapted it from the novel Point of Impact by Stephen Hunter, published in 1993. Hunter is actually a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author who spent decades as the film critic for The Washington Post before becoming known for his series of novels featuring Bob Lee Swagger, who has appeared in multiple books and has become something of a cult figure among fans of action fiction. Hunter's novels are known for their extraordinary attention to detail when it comes to firearms and tactical operations, and for their willingness to engage seriously with questions about American identity, military service, and political corruption. The book Point of Impact was the first Swagger novel and established the template for everything that followed. Lemkin's adaptation keeps the core of what makes the novel work while streamlining it for a 2-hour film format, and for the most part the adaptation is quite successful. The film was produced by Paramount Pictures and distributed by that studio, so it had a proper theatrical release with a real marketing push behind it. It was not a small independent production or a streaming original. This was a major studio action thriller with a real budget, real marketing, and real expectations behind it. The production team included Lorenzo di Bonaventura as one of the key producers, a name you'll recognize from a lot of major Hollywood productions over the years. Di Bonaventura has been involved in everything from the Transformers franchise to Salt to G.I. Joe, and he brings a real understanding of how to make commercially appealing entertainment that still has substance to it. In terms of the inspiration behind the story, there's a lot to unpack. Stephen Hunter has spoken extensively about what drove him to create the Swagger character and the world of Point of Impact. Hunter grew up with a deep fascination with the mechanics of shooting and the culture around it, and he was interested in exploring what happens to men who are extraordinarily skilled at something that society simultaneously valorizes and finds uncomfortable, namely, the ability to inflict harm at great distance with precision. The sniper as a figure is fascinating precisely because of that tension. Society needs people with that skill during wartime, but then struggles with what to do with those people once the war is over. Hunter was also interested in conspiracy narratives and what it means to be an individual fighting against systems of power that are far larger and better resourced than any single person. That David versus Goliath dynamic is at the core of Shooter's appeal. The film taps into a very specific strain of American paranoia that was particularly resonant in 2007. A few years into the Iraq War, and at a time when public trust in government and military institutions was at a notable low. The story of a loyal soldier who is betrayed by the very people he served is a classic American narrative, but in 2007 it had a specific political charge that made it connect with audiences in a visceral way. Fuqua and the production were clearly aware of this context and leaned into it, making sure the film's political dimension was not just window dressing but actually central to what the story was saying. The villains of Shooter are not foreign terrorists or random criminals. They are American power brokers, military figures, politicians, people with security clearances and government salaries who have decided that the rules don't apply to them. Getting into the cast a little more, it's worth talking about the ensemble as a whole, because one of Shooter's real strengths is that nobody in the film feels like they're just walking through the motions or collecting a paycheck. Even the actors in smaller roles bring genuine commitment to their characters, which elevates the material considerably. When you have someone like Ned Beatty in a supporting role, you feel the weight of his experience and capability behind every moment he's on screen. And the same is true of Danny Glover, who could easily have played a less interesting version of Johnson, but instead chose to make him genuinely three-dimensional. That kind of commitment across the board is not something you always get in action thrillers, where secondary characters can sometimes feel like they exist purely to be obstacles or exposition delivery systems. Michael Peña's chemistry with Mark Wahlberg is one of the highlights of the film. These are two actors who have very different energies and very different approaches, and that contrast works beautifully for the dynamic between Swagger and Nick Memphis. Swagger is controlled, precise, economical with his words and his movements. Nick is more volatile, more prone to uncertainty, more likely to say the wrong thing at the wrong moment. Watching them figure each other out and ultimately learn to trust each other is genuinely satisfying in a way that a lot of buddy dynamics in action films aren't, because you can see the logic of why these specific people would end up relying on each other despite everything that should keep them apart. The chemistry between Wahlberg and Kate Mara is different in nature but equally effective. There's a restrained quality to their scenes together that feels very true to who these characters are. Swagger is not a man who expresses his feelings easily or openly. He's someone who shows care through action rather than words, through showing up and doing what needs to be done rather than making declarations. Mara is excellent at responding to that, matching his restraint while conveying real emotion underneath the surface. The scenes they share have a quiet intensity that provides a different kind of tension from the more obviously action-oriented sequences in the film. Now, the question everyone wants to get to when discussing Shooter is the conspiracy itself and who exactly is behind everything. The setup, as we discussed, involves Swagger being recruited under false pretenses and then framed for something he didn't do. But the why of all this is where things get particularly interesting and where the film engages most directly with its political themes. The conspiracy at the center of Shooter connects to events that took place years before the main story, specifically to an incident in Africa where a village was effectively destroyed to enable an oil pipeline to go through. This is not an incident that Swagger had any involvement in, but he becomes useful to the conspirators precisely because of his skills and his known background. By framing him, they can explain away an inconvenient death and eliminate a potential loose end at the same time. It's a bureaucratic kind of evil, which makes it particularly disturbing. These people aren't doing what they're doing out of passion or ideology. They're doing it because it's convenient and profitable and because they're confident they can get away with it. Colonel Johnson, as played by Glover, is the operational mastermind of this scheme. He's the one who identifies Swagger as the perfect patsy, who engineers the setup, and who manages the cover-up when things start to go sideways. Johnson is fascinating because he's a military man who has spent his career supposedly serving his country, and in his own mind, he probably still frames what he does in those terms. But the corruption has gone so deep that he can no longer actually tell the difference between serving the nation and serving his own interests and the interests of the powerful people around him. That's a chilling portrait of what long-term exposure to power without accountability can do to a person. Senator Meacham, in Ned Beatty's hands, represents the political dimension of the conspiracy. He's the civilian power that gives Johnson's operations their cover and their resources. He's the one who can make phone calls and open doors that are closed to everyone else. He's also the one who delivers one of the most memorable and disturbing speeches in the film, a monologue about how the world actually works and how the people in power have always operated outside the rules that everyone else is supposed to follow. It's a brilliant scene because Beatty plays it with such comfortable matter-of-factness, as though he's genuinely confused why anyone would find this surprising or upsetting. He's not defensive or apologetic about any of it. In his worldview, this is just how things are, how they've always been. And there's almost an invitation in his manner for Swagger to accept this reality and find a way to benefit from it rather than fight against it. The role of various law enforcement and government agencies in the film is worth exploring in some detail, because Shooter is very much a movie about institutions and what happens when those institutions are compromised or corrupted. The FBI, as represented primarily through the character of Nick Memphis, is shown as an institution that can still be a force for good when the right people within it are willing to do the hard work of following the truth. Nick's journey through the film is essentially about choosing between institutional loyalty and actual justice, and his choice to pursue the latter, even at personal risk, is one of the more heroic arcs in the story. But the film is careful not to be naive about institutions either. Nick's superiors are not particularly interested in the truth if pursuing it means embarrassing the Bureau or creating diplomatic problems. The FBI as a whole is shown as being capable of being manipulated and used, even when individual agents within it are acting with integrity. What's particularly clever about how Shooter handles these institutional dynamics is that it doesn't fall into the trap of making everyone in authority a villain. There are people in government and law enforcement who are doing their jobs honestly and well. The problem is that they're embedded in systems that can be captured and directed by the kind of powerful, connected bad actors that Johnson and Meacham represent. The corruption is not omnipresent, but it's strategic, placed at key nodes of power in ways that allow a small number of people to exercise enormous control over outcomes that affect many. That's actually a pretty sophisticated political observation for an action thriller, and it's one of the reasons Shooter holds up as something more than just a mindless shooting gallery. On a more technical level, the film is beautifully shot by cinematographer Peter Menzies Jr., who does exceptional work creating a visual language that serves the story's themes. The Wyoming sequences that open the film establish Swagger in his natural environment with wide, sweeping landscape shots that communicate his isolation and his connection to the land in an almost wordless way. There's a visual poetry to seeing this extraordinarily skilled man living alone in the mountains, reduced to simplicity and solitude, that makes everything that follows feel like a genuine disruption and violation of something valuable. Menzies knows how to use natural light and the expansiveness of outdoor locations to create a sense of scale and loneliness, and then to contrast that with the claustrophobic, controlled environments that represent the world of institutional power and conspiracy. The urban sequences in the film have a different visual quality, grittier and more compressed, with less light and less room. There's a reason for that visual contrast, and it's not just aesthetic. When Swagger is in natural environments, he's in his element, at home, capable. When he's in cities and corridors of power, he's operating in someone else's territory, and the visual language reflects that. Menzies uses color temperature throughout the film in ways that reinforce these distinctions, with the outdoor sequences often having a cooler, cleaner quality, and the institutional environments having a sickly, artificial warmth that suggests something slightly wrong, even when everything looks polished and professional. The action sequences in Shooter are genuinely impressive and deserve extended discussion. Fuqua is an excellent action director because he prioritizes clarity and consequence over chaos. You always know where you are in space during a Shooter action sequence. You understand the geography of what's happening and why it matters. That sounds like a basic thing, but it's actually surprisingly rare. A lot of action films sacrifice spatial clarity for the illusion of energy and excitement, cutting so fast and covering the camera so much that you lose track of who's where and what's actually happening. Fuqua doesn't do that. He lets scenes breathe enough that you can actually appreciate the choreography and the craft that's gone into constructing them. The film also takes its time to establish the mechanics of what Swagger does before showing it in action. We understand the principles of long-range shooting, the mathematics of wind and distance and gravity that a sniper has to account for, before we see Swagger applying those principles. That groundwork pays dividends later in the film because when action sequences involving long-range work happen, we understand what we're watching rather than just experiencing it as spectacle. The film respects the audience enough to believe they can handle a certain amount of technical information, and that having that information will make the payoffs more satisfying rather than less. The sound design in Shooter is also noteworthy. The film's sound team did exceptional work distinguishing between different types of firearms and different acoustic environments. Shots fired in open landscapes sound completely different from shots fired in enclosed spaces, and that attention to sonic detail contributes significantly to the film's sense of authenticity. You believe that the people making this film understood what they were depicting, and that understanding is communicated partly through sound in ways that many viewers wouldn't consciously identify but would feel on an instinctive level. Mark Isham composed the film's score, and it's worth discussing because music in action thrillers often goes completely unnoticed, even when it's doing important work. Isham's score for Shooter is purposeful and restrained, building tension without ever overwhelming the action or becoming intrusive. He understands that his job is to serve the story rather than to draw attention to himself, and the result is a score that you might not specifically remember, but that you'd notice the absence of if it weren't there. It creates emotional context and propulsive energy in the moments when the film needs those things, and steps back when silence or ambient sound serves better. In terms of pacing, Shooter is a film that knows what it is and maintains that identity consistently throughout its running time. The film runs approximately 124 minutes, which is a substantial length for an action thriller, but one that Fuqua justifies through careful attention to character and story. There's very little in this film that feels like filler or padding. Even the quieter character moments serve the larger narrative, either developing relationships that will pay off later or establishing information that becomes important in the third act. Fuqua has good instincts for knowing when a scene has done its job and it's time to move on, and those instincts keep Shooter from feeling bloated even at its 2+ hour length. The third act of the film is where everything comes together, and it's genuinely satisfying in a way that a lot of conspiracy thrillers aren't. One of the perennial problems with this genre is that the denouement, the moment when the truth is revealed and justice is supposedly served, can feel anticlimactic or unsatisfying, particularly when the story has built to such significant promises. Shooter navigates this challenge cleverly by acknowledging the limitations of the official justice system within the world of the film, making the resolution honest about the fact that some forms of corruption are so deeply embedded and so well protected that conventional justice can never reach them. That honesty is uncomfortable, but it's also refreshing, and it allows the film to pursue a resolution that feels true to its themes rather than just comfortable. What Swagger ultimately achieves is not a courtroom vindication, not a press conference where the truth comes out and everyone lives happily ever after. The resolution is messier and more morally complex than that, which fits perfectly with what the film has been saying about power and corruption throughout its running time. Without going into excessive detail about specific events, the ending of Shooter is the kind of ending that stays with you because it refuses easy comfort while still providing genuine catharsis. Swagger emerges not as a celebrated hero, but as a man who has done what needed to be done and now has to live with all of it. That's a very different kind of action hero ending than Hollywood typically delivers, and it's one of the things that distinguishes Shooter from more conventional entries in the genre. Now, reception. Shooter was released in March 2007 and opened at #1 at the box office, which was a strong commercial result that validated Paramount's investment in the project. The film earned approximately $47 million in the United States and around $95 million worldwide, against a production budget reported to be in the range of $61 million, making it a solid, if not spectacular, commercial success. The numbers were good enough to generate discussion about sequels, though a theatrical sequel never materialized. What did eventually happen was that USA Network developed a television series also called Shooter, with Ryan Philippe in the lead role, which ran for 3 seasons from 2016 to 2018. The series earned its own dedicated fan base while naturally being compared to the original film throughout its run. Critical reception for the film was mixed to moderately positive. The review aggregator Rotten Tomatoes shows a score in the mid to low range among professional critics, which reflects a split between those who appreciated the film's craft and political dimension, and those who found it formulaic or felt that its politics were too simplistic. The more positive reviews tended to praise Wahlberg's performance, Fuqua's direction, and the film's willingness to engage with genuinely dark political territory. The more negative reviews tended to focus on what critics saw as implausibilities in the plot or an oversimplification of complex issues. Audiences, as measured by platforms like CinemaScore, tended to respond more positively than professional critics, which is not uncommon for action thrillers that are designed to deliver visceral satisfaction alongside more intellectual pleasures. Looking at the film's strengths, there are several that stand out clearly. Mark Wahlberg's performance is the foundation of everything. He's completely believable as someone with Swagger's skills and background, and he brings a real emotional depth to what could easily have been a one-dimensional tough guy role. The fact that you care about Swagger as a person, not just as a spectacle of competence, is a testament to what Wahlberg contributes. He makes you feel the weight of everything this character has been through and everything he stands to lose, which gives the action sequences stakes beyond the purely physical. The political dimension of the film is another genuine strength. Shooter is not pretending to be apolitical, which is increasingly rare for mainstream Hollywood action films. It has actual things to say about power, corruption, and the relationship between military service and political exploitation, and it says them clearly enough to be understood while trusting the audience to engage with those ideas rather than having everything spelled out in the broadest possible terms. That combination of commercial entertainment and genuine thematic ambition is a difficult balance to strike, and Shooter largely manages it. Fuqua's direction is consistently strong, as we've discussed. He brings technical craft and narrative clarity to every sequence, and he's clearly working with a genuine understanding of and respect for the film's subject matter. The action sequences are among the best in any mid-2000s Hollywood thriller, choreographed with an attention to physics and consequence that makes them feel grounded even when they're intensely dramatic. The supporting cast, particularly Danny Glover and Ned Beatty as the film's antagonists, provides a quality of performance that elevates the material. Their villains are not caricatures. They're recognizable human beings who have made a series of compromising choices over a long period of time until they've ended up somewhere they might not have imagined themselves being when they were younger. And that human dimension makes them far more disturbing than any amount of theatrical villainy would. In terms of weaknesses, the most commonly cited issue is that the plot, when examined closely, contains some logical leaps and convenient coincidences that require a certain amount of audience goodwill to accept. Conspiracy thrillers are particularly vulnerable to this kind of critique because they need to construct elaborate mechanisms that connect disparate elements, and those mechanisms don't always bear close scrutiny. Shooter is not uniquely guilty of this problem, but it's not immune to it either. There are moments where you might find yourself thinking that a smarter, more alert group of conspirators might have closed off the avenue that Swagger finds his way through, and if you follow that line of thinking too far, it can undermine your engagement with the story. Some viewers also found that the film's political perspective, while genuine and coherent was more polemical than analytical. The villains of Shooter are unambiguously villainous in their motivations and methods, and some critics felt that this moral clarity was too easy, that a more sophisticated treatment of the same themes might have left more room for ambiguity and complexity. This is a fair critique, though it's worth noting that the film's target audience and commercial context make a certain degree of moral clarity appropriate. Not every political film needs to be a nuanced academic exercise, and Shooter's clarity about who the bad guys are and why they're bad doesn't prevent it from making genuine points about institutional corruption. The film occasionally rushes through character development in service of plot momentum, which means that some of the secondary characters feel slightly underserved. Kate Mara's Sarah has more potential than the film fully explores, and her character arc could have benefited from additional scenes that developed her as more than a supporting figure in Swagger's story. Similarly, some of the antagonists beyond Johnson and Meacham are more functional than fully realized, serving primarily as obstacles rather than as characters in their own right. Should you watch Shooter if you haven't seen it? Absolutely, and that's not really a difficult recommendation to make. This is a well-crafted, genuinely engaging action thriller from a director at the height of his powers, featuring one of Mark Wahlberg's best screen performances, with real thematic substance underneath the exciting surface. It's the kind of film that Hollywood used to make quite regularly and makes less often now, where serious resources and talent are applied to genre entertainment with the intention of producing something that both entertains and resonates. If you enjoy action thrillers at all, Shooter is essential viewing. For those who have already seen the film, it holds up remarkably well to rewatching. Knowing where the conspiracy leads makes the setup sequences in the film even more interesting, because you can see how carefully the trap is laid and appreciate the craft of the villain's scheming even as you're rooting against them. You also notice things in Wahlberg's performance on a second viewing that you might have missed the first time, subtle moments where Swagger's instincts are already sensing something is wrong even before he has conscious knowledge of it. Good performances reward rewatching, and Wahlberg's work in this film is no exception. Speaking of the film's legacy, Shooter has had an interesting trajectory in terms of how it's been received over time. In the immediate aftermath of its release, it was appreciated primarily as a solid action thriller with some political edge. As time has passed and the political climate has continued to evolve, the film's themes have, if anything, become more rather than less resonant. The questions it raises about who really holds power, about how institutions can be captured and used by small groups of well-connected individuals, about what accountability means when the people who are supposed to provide it are themselves compromised. These are questions that have only gotten more urgent in the years since 2007. That growing relevance has contributed to Shooter developing a strong fan base among people who came to it years after its initial release. The film has also benefited from the reassessment of Mark Wahlberg's career that has happened over time. In 2007, Wahlberg was a significant star, but was still sometimes underestimated as an actor, seen by some critics as a personality performer rather than a genuine acting talent. Subsequent years and subsequent performances have shifted that perception, and looking back at Shooter through the lens of what we now know Wahlberg is capable of, the film seems even more impressive. He's doing real work here, not just coasting on charisma, and that work holds up. Stephen Hunter's source novel has also had its own continued life and readership, and the character of Bob Lee Swagger has continued to appear in subsequent novels. Hunter has published many books in the Swagger series, and they've developed a devoted following among readers who appreciate both the technical depth of the firearms writing and the political and moral seriousness of the storytelling. The 2007 film introduced many people to the swagger world, who then went on to explore the books, which is one of the better outcomes of a literary adaptation in terms of benefits for everyone involved. Antoine Fuqua's career continued to develop in interesting directions after Shooter. He went on to make the Equalizer films with Denzel Washington, which share some thematic DNA with Shooter in their interest in a supremely capable individual taking on a corrupt system in defense of ordinary people. He also made Southpaw with Jake Gyllenhaal and directed the remake of The Magnificent Seven with Denzel Washington and Chris Pratt. Fuqua has established himself as one of the most consistently interesting directors working in Hollywood's action thriller space, and Shooter remains one of the signature achievements of his filmography. One aspect of Shooter that deserves more attention in discussions of the film is its treatment of the geography and landscape of America. The film moves through several very different American environments, from the mountain wilderness of Wyoming to the streets of various cities to the corridors of power in Washington, and each of these environments is rendered with a distinct visual and atmospheric identity. This geographical range serves the story's themes by showing that the corruption at the heart of the conspiracy extends across the full breadth of American society, from its most remote and apparently untouched corners to its most powerful. No part of the American landscape is entirely separate from what Johnson and Meacham represent, and the film's visual journey through that landscape makes that point without ever having to state it directly. The Wyoming sequences are particularly significant because they establish what Swagger is fighting to get back to, what he's lost when the conspiracy forces him out of the simple, honest life he's constructed for himself. There's something genuinely elegiac about the opening of the film, the sense of a man who has found peace and chosen solitude and made something meaningful from the ruins of a complicated past. When that's taken from him, the stakes feel personal in a way that goes beyond just his freedom or his reputation. He's fighting for the right to exist on his own terms in a space of his own choosing, and that's a deeply human thing to be fighting for. The film's treatment of military culture and the experience of veterans is another dimension worth exploring. Swagger is clearly someone who served with distinction and commitment, who gave everything to his country and was rewarded with abandonment and betrayal. The dynamic between him and Johnson is interesting precisely because Johnson is also a military man, which means the betrayal has an additional dimension of violated brotherhood. There's supposed to be a code and understanding between people who have served together and shared the kind of experiences that military service involves. Johnson's willingness to sacrifice Swagger represents a violation of that code that goes beyond the political and into the personal. The film also engages seriously with the question of what skills like Swagger's actually cost, not in terms of money or training time, but in terms of what they do to a person. Swagger is clearly someone who has seen and done things that have marked him deeply, who carries a weight that he's managing rather than having truly set down. His isolation in Wyoming is not just a lifestyle choice, but a necessary adaptation, a way of keeping himself away from a world that he knows he could harm if he weren't careful about how he operates within it. That self-awareness and self-control are presented as admirable qualities, and the film respects Swagger enough to show that the skills it's celebrating are also burdens. The question of trust runs through the entire film as a central theme. Swagger has to learn when to trust and whom, having been comprehensively betrayed at the outset. Nick Memphis faces his own version of the same challenge, having to decide whether to trust his official superiors or his own growing conviction that something is wrong. Sarah must decide whether to trust a man she barely knows who appears on her doorstep with an extraordinary story. The film suggests that trust, real trust, earned through demonstrated integrity and honest action, is one of the most valuable and most endangered things in a world full of people who will exploit it whenever it appears. The relationships that develop between Swagger, Nick, and Sarah are built on exactly that kind of demonstrated trust, and that's what makes them feel genuine. There's also an interesting relationship in the film between individual capability and institutional power. Swagger's situation at the start of the film could be read as a story about what happens when extraordinary individual capability has no institutional home. He's out of the military, living alone, his skills disconnected from any larger structure or purpose. The conspirators exploit this by giving him a purpose, albeit a false one, that plugs his individual capability back into an institutional context, their institutional context. Swagger then has to find a way to use those same individual capabilities against institutional power, which is the central dramatic engine of the film's second and third acts. Nick Memphis represents a different relationship with institutions. He's embedded within one, committed to it, drawing his identity from it to a significant degree. His journey is about learning to hold that institutional identity lightly enough that he can act against the institution's interests when the institution's interests diverge from actual justice. That's a much harder thing to do from inside than from outside, and the film is perceptive about the specific kind of courage it requires. The film's climax brings these themes together in a way that feels earned and satisfying. When justice is finally served, it happens through individual action rather than through institutional process. And the film is honest about both the satisfactions and the complications of that reality. The system has failed in the specific case that Shooter depicts, and the resolution acknowledges that failure rather than pretending that the system ultimately worked as designed. That honesty is part of what makes the ending resonate as strongly as it does. In terms of its place in the larger landscape of action thrillers from the 2000s, Shooter sits interestingly alongside films like the Jason Bourne series, which was also exploring questions of institutional betrayal and individual resilience during the same period. The Bourne films share Shooter's interest in a highly trained individual who has been discarded or betrayed by the institution that created him, and who then turns his skills against that institution in pursuit of truth and justice. But where the Bourne films often have an amnesiac quality to their protagonist, with identity being uncertain and unstable, Swagger knows exactly who he is. His certainty of self is actually his greatest strength, because it means that no amount of official narrative or media framing can undermine his own understanding of what happened and what needs to happen next. It's also worth comparing Shooter to the tradition of American conspiracy thrillers that runs from the 1970s through to the present. Films like The Parallax View, 3 Days of the Condor, and All the President's Men established a template for exploring institutional corruption and conspiracy through the lens of ordinary or extraordinary individuals discovering truths that powerful people want kept hidden. Shooter is clearly in conversation with that tradition, updating it for a post-9/11 context and a contemporary political environment while keeping faith with the core DNA of what makes conspiracy thrillers work. The paranoid sensibility of 1970s American cinema found renewed relevance in the mid-2000s, and Shooter is one of the more successful examples of how that sensibility was updated and applied to a new era. One of the less discussed but genuinely important aspects of Shooter is how it handles the relationship between competence and ethics. In a lot of action films, competence is celebrated more or less unconditionally. The cool thing about the hero is that he can do extraordinary things, and the moral dimension of those things tends to be subordinated to the celebration of the capability itself. Shooter is more thoughtful than that. Swagger's competence is presented as genuinely admirable, but the film is careful to anchor it in a moral framework. He uses his skills in service of truth and justice, and the film consistently shows the cost and consequence of those skills in ways that ground them in human reality. The antagonists, crucially, also have their own forms of competence. Johnson is good at what he does. The conspiracy he constructs is sophisticated and multi-layered. Meacham is a skilled political operator who understands power and how to wield it. The film doesn't suggest that the bad guys are bad because they're incompetent or stupid. They're bad because they've applied their very real competence in service of deeply wrong ends, which is a more disturbing and more honest portrait of how institutional corruption actually works. It's not usually bumbling incompetence that enables corruption. It's the application of genuine capability without genuine accountability. The film's attitude toward the audience is also worth noting. Shooter treats its viewers as intelligent adults who can handle complexity and ambiguity, who don't need every point underlined 3 times to be sure they've gotten it, who are capable of being moved by character as well as spectacle. That respectful attitude is not universal in mainstream Hollywood entertainment, and when you encounter it, it makes a significant difference in the viewing experience. You feel trusted as a viewer, which makes you more engaged and more willing to invest emotionally in what's happening on screen. By the time Shooter reaches its conclusion, you've been taken on a journey through some of the darker possibilities of American institutional life, while also having been given a genuinely exciting and technically impressive action thriller to enjoy. That combination is Shooter's greatest achievement. It delivers exactly what you came for in terms of entertainment, while also leaving you with something to think about after the credits roll. That's the definition of a film that succeeds both as commerce and as art, and it's why Shooter has retained its audience and its reputation in the years since its release. Whether you're coming to Shooter for the first time or returning to it after having seen it years ago, it rewards the attention you bring to it. It's a film made by people who cared about what they were making, featuring performances from actors at or near the top of their game, exploring themes that remain urgent and relevant in a genre that, at its best, tells us truths about ourselves and our society through the elevated, dramatic language of action and consequence. There's a reason this film has stayed in the conversation for nearly 2 decades, and that reason is simply that it's very, very good. So there you have it, a full deep dive into Shooter from 2007. We've talked about the plot, the characters, the conspiracy, the performances, the direction, the cinematography, the music, the themes, the reception, the legacy, and just about everything in between. If you've made it this far, thank you genuinely for sticking with us. That means a lot. Drop a comment below and let us know what you think about Shooter. Is it one of your favorites? Did you watch it back in 2007 or discover it later? What do you think about Wahlberg's performance or Fuqua's direction? We love hearing from you guys and we read every comment. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is a great time to do that. And ring that notification bell so you don't miss our next breakdown. We'll see you in the next one. Actually, you know what? Before we wrap things up completely, there are a few more things about this film that I feel like we'd be doing you a disservice by not mentioning. Because when you really sit with Shooter for a while, when you let it marinate a little bit, there are layers to this thing that don't reveal themselves immediately. And honestly, that's one of the hallmarks of a film that was made with genuine intention rather than just assembled by committee to hit certain demographic targets and move on. So let's keep going. because we're clearly not done here. One of the things that strikes you on deeper reflection about Shooter is how it handles the idea of expertise in a world that is increasingly skeptical of it. Bob Lee Swagger is, by every measurable standard, an expert. He knows things about ballistics, about long-range shooting, about the physics of projectiles in various atmospheric conditions that very few people alive can match. And the film presents that expertise with genuine respect, taking the time to actually explain some of the mechanics so that we understand what we're watching rather than just accepting it as movie magic. There's a scene early in the film where Swagger is essentially doing calculations in his head that most people would need sophisticated equipment to perform, and the film trusts us enough to follow that without dumbing it down. In a media landscape where expertise is often treated with suspicion or presented as somehow elitist, Shooter's genuine respect for the depth of knowledge that Swagger has accumulated is actually kind of refreshing. The movie is saying, clearly and without apology, that some people know things that other people don't, and that this is not a problem but a fact of life that we should take seriously. What's interesting is that this respect for expertise extends to the antagonists as well. We've talked about how Johnson and Meacham are presented as genuinely capable rather than comically incompetent, but it's worth going deeper on that. Johnson clearly has a deep and sophisticated understanding of how military and intelligence operations work, how to structure a plan so that multiple layers of plausible deniability exist, how to leverage institutional trust to achieve personal ends. His expertise is being deployed in service of genuinely problematic goals, but the expertise itself is real and formidable. The film understands that the most dangerous kinds of corruption are not the obviously bumbling kind, but the sophisticated, careful, deeply informed kind, and it depicts that with clarity. That's actually a more honest portrait of how institutional wrongdoing operates in the real world than you typically get in mainstream entertainment. The film is also fascinating in terms of how it thinks about loyalty. Loyalty is one of those values that gets discussed a lot in military and law enforcement contexts, and it's often presented as an unambiguous virtue. Shooter is much more nuanced about it than that. Swagger's loyalty to his partner, his loyalty to his country, his loyalty to the principles he was trained to serve, these are all genuine and deeply held. But the film shows how those same loyalties can be exploited by people who understand them and are willing to use them as tools. Johnson recruits Swagger precisely because he knows about Swagger's loyalty, knows that a man with that kind of commitment can be manipulated if you frame the situation correctly. The conspiracy works in large part because it leverages real virtues, genuine loyalty, genuine patriotism, genuine duty, and turns them into liabilities. This is one of the more sophisticated things Shooter has to say, and it's delivered through action and character rather than through dialogue or exposition, which is the right way to do it in a film like this. We see Swagger being manipulated not because he's naive or stupid, but because the people manipulating him understand his values better than they understand his doubts. The antidote, as the film presents it, is not less loyalty, but better judgment about where that loyalty is truly warranted. Swagger ultimately redirects his loyalty from the institutions that betrayed him toward the individuals who proved themselves worthy of it through their actions, and that redirect is at the heart of his character's journey. Nick Memphis goes through a parallel version of this process. His loyalty to the FBI, to the institution and what it represents, is genuine. But he comes to understand that loyalty to an institution is only as meaningful as the institution's actual commitment to the values it claims to represent. When those values are being violated from within, Loyalty to the institution can become a way of being complicit in that violation. Nick's growth through the film is about learning to distinguish between the principle and the organization, between the actual justice that the FBI is supposed to serve, and the organizational self-interest that can cause the FBI to act against that justice. It's a distinction that matters enormously, and one that many people never work out clearly, and watching Nick work it out under pressure is one of the genuinely satisfying character arcs in the film. Let's talk for a minute about what Shooter says about the media and public narrative, because this is another dimension of the film that doesn't get discussed enough. Once Swagger is framed, one of the key elements of the conspiracy's success is the narrative that gets constructed around him and disseminated through official channels. The media, law enforcement agencies, and political figures all participate in constructing and spreading a story about Swagger that is false, but has the enormous advantage of institutional backing and apparent official credibility. Swagger can't counter this narrative through official channels because those channels are compromised. He can't go to the press because the press is operating on the information it's been given by the same compromised sources. He can't go to law enforcement because law enforcement is actively hunting him based on the false narrative. He's caught in a situation where the truth is effectively invisible because all the mechanisms that are supposed to reveal truth have been captured by the people spreading the lie. This dynamic feels remarkably prescient for a film made in 2007. The relationship between institutional narratives, media coverage, and actual truth has become one of the central anxieties of contemporary life in ways that were perhaps less universally felt when Shooter was released, but are now very much front of mind for a lot of people. The film doesn't resolve this tension neatly, because it can't. Individual truth-telling is valuable but fragile against the weight of institutional narrative, and Shooter is honest about that fragility. The way Swagger ultimately prevails doesn't involve convincing the public of the truth or winning a media war. It involves taking the problem to a level where narrative control becomes irrelevant, which is both dramatically satisfying and darkly telling about how the film understands the limits of public discourse. There's also something worth saying about the film's treatment of physical vulnerability and recovery. In a lot of action films, the hero takes enormous amounts of punishment and bounces back almost immediately, shaking off injuries that would leave ordinary people incapacitated for weeks or months. Shooter is more honest about the body's limits than most films in the genre. Swagger gets seriously hurt at certain points in the story, and the film actually shows the aftermath of that damage and what he has to do to keep functioning. He doesn't just take a punch and walk it off. He has to be strategic about managing his physical state, about what he can and can't ask his body to do given the damage it has taken. This physical honesty serves the film's broader commitment to groundedness and authenticity. It also makes the moments when Swagger does push through genuine physical limitation feel more impressive rather than less, because we understand what it's actually costing him. The medical sequences in the film, where Swagger has to deal with injuries in improvised circumstances without access to proper medical care, are some of the more striking in the film, precisely because of how matter-of-fact they are. Swagger approaches his own physical problems with the same systematic competence that he applies to everything else, treating his body as a system that needs to be maintained rather than as an invincible vehicle for action heroics. There's something actually humanizing about seeing a character this capable be forced to confront the realities of flesh and bone, and it's a choice that Antoine Fuqua makes deliberately, ensuring that we never quite lose sight of the fact that our hero is a person rather than a superhuman. While we're on the subject of things the film does that many action movies don't, let's talk about patience. Shooter is a patient film in a way that a lot of genre entries from the same era aren't. It takes its time establishing Swagger's world before disrupting it. It takes its time developing the conspiracy before revealing it. It takes its time letting characters develop relationships before testing those relationships. That patience creates investment. When things go wrong for characters we've had time to understand and care about, the impact is proportionally greater. When the conspiracies are revealed with enough detail to actually understand them, the outrage they generate feels grounded in genuine comprehension rather than just narrative instruction to feel a certain way. This patience is a directorial choice as much as a writing one. Fuqua clearly understood that the film's ambitions required a certain amount of time and space to breathe, and he was willing to resist the pressure that always exists in commercial filmmaking to accelerate, to get to the next exciting thing before the audience has fully absorbed the previous exciting thing. The result is a film that feels substantial and purposeful rather than frantically busy, and that substantiality is part of what makes it hold up over repeated viewings in a way that a lot of faster, slicker films from the same era don't. Something that's also interesting about Shooter from a craft perspective is how it uses geography as a narrative tool. The film's story involves Swagger moving through different physical environments, and each move communicates something about where he is in his larger journey. The wide-open Wyoming wilderness of the opening represents freedom and self-determination. The controlled, surveilled environments of official Washington represent institutional power at its most concentrated. The in-between spaces, motel rooms, anonymous urban streets, the kinds of places where people who are off the grid live and move, represent the contested territory where individual agency and institutional power are in active conflict. Fuqua and his cinematographer use these environmental transitions deliberately, reinforcing narrative information through visual storytelling in ways that work even without conscious audience awareness of the technique. The film's use of physical objects as narrative tools is similarly thoughtful. Firearms, obviously, are central to the story in ways that go beyond just being props for action sequences. The specific weapons that Swagger uses, how he handles them, how he thinks about them, communicate character information. There's a scene where we see how Swagger maintains and cares for his equipment that tells us as much about who he is as any dialogue could. The relationship between a craftsman and his tools is a revealing thing, and Shooter understands this and uses it. The precision and care that Swagger applies to his equipment is a window into a mind that values precision and care generally, that takes its responsibilities seriously and does not approach its work casually. Other physical objects in the film carry similar weight. The satellite phone that connects Swagger to Nick after they begin to develop their unlikely alliance is a small object that represents an enormous amount of trust and risk. The documents and evidence that accumulate as the truth of the conspiracy becomes clearer serve as physical manifestations of the abstract concept of truth itself, things that can be held and verified rather than just asserted. The film is thoughtful about these details in ways that contribute to its overall feeling of craft and intention. Let's shift gears a little and think about Shooter in the context of the broader tradition of the American Western, because there's actually a significant amount of Western DNA in the film's genetic makeup. Bob Lee Swagger is in many ways a Western hero transposed into a contemporary setting. He's a man of extraordinary skill who lives by a strict personal code, who operates at the margins of society rather than at its center, who has a complex and somewhat tragic relationship with violence as a capability and as a reality. These are classic Western protagonist qualities, and Shooter leans into that legacy in ways that enhance rather than diminish its contemporary relevance. The landscapes of the film, particularly the Wyoming sequences, reinforce this Western quality. Wide open spaces, mountains, isolation, the sense of a man who is most himself when he's free of the corruption and compromise of civilization. When Swagger retreats to the mountains at various points in the film, it's not just a tactical choice but a spiritual one, a return to a kind of clarity and honesty that the world of institutional power makes impossible. This is very much the movement of the Western hero, from the complicated moral terrain of society into the simpler, starker clarity of the wilderness. The film's antagonists are also recognizable as Western villains in contemporary dress. The corrupt, powerful men who run things for their own benefit at the expense of the common good are a classic Western archetype, and Meacham and Johnson fit that template very neatly. They're the railroad barons and corrupt sheriffs of the traditional Western translated into senators and military officials, but the essential shape of the power they represent and the way they wield it is essentially unchanged. Shooter understands this lineage and uses it, connecting its story to a long tradition of American popular storytelling about the tension between individual integrity and institutional corruption. The climactic resolution of the film also echoes the Western in interesting ways. The genre has always been attracted to the idea of justice that operates outside or alongside the official system, of situations where the formal mechanisms of law and order have been captured by the wrong people, and where individual action becomes the only available recourse for genuine justice. This is obviously a morally complex idea, and the best Westerns have always been honest about that complexity rather than celebrating it uncritically. Shooter follows in that tradition, giving us a resolution that feels just while also acknowledging the uncomfortable implications of the path that leads to it. One more thing worth discussing in depth is the film's approach to friendship and what it means under pressure. The relationship between Swagger and Nick Memphis is the heart of the film in many ways, more central even than the action sequences or the conspiracy, because it's the human core around which everything else is organized. These two men have no obvious reason to trust each other, and many obvious reasons not to. Swagger is a fugitive, Nick is law enforcement. Swagger is experienced and capable, Nick is inexperienced and uncertain. Swagger has every reason to believe that his only safety lies in operating completely alone, and Nick has every professional obligation to treat Swagger as a subject of investigation rather than as an ally. The fact that they find their way to genuine mutual trust and collaborative action despite all of this is the film's most optimistic argument. Its suggestion that basic human decency and commitment to truth can overcome institutional opposition and reasonable suspicion. The development of that trust is handled carefully and believably. It's not immediate. Nick doesn't simply decide to believe Swagger because Swagger seems sincere. He investigates, he tests, he looks for evidence independent of what Swagger tells him. And Swagger doesn't simply decide to trust Nick because Nick seems honest. He watches how Nick behaves under pressure, how he responds to discovering uncomfortable truths, whether his actions match his stated commitment. The trust that develops between them is earned through demonstrated behavior rather than just asserted through declaration, and that makes it feel real and meaningful in a way that rushed or unearned trust in movies rarely does. There's actually a kind of model in the Swagger-Nick relationship for how functional human collaboration is supposed to work, how you build genuine trust with someone you have reason to be suspicious of, how you balance appropriate caution with openness to persuasion, how you let evidence rather than preconception guide your assessment of a person and a situation. The film presents this not as a lesson, but as a story, which is the right way to do it, but the lesson is there for anyone who wants to find it. The film's ending, and we'll be deliberately careful here to discuss it in terms of themes rather than specific plot details for those who somehow haven't seen it yet, does something brave that mainstream Hollywood films often shy away from. It doesn't wrap everything up in a completely comfortable bow. Some things are resolved, some justice is achieved, but the larger systemic problems that the film has been pointing to throughout remain unresolved, because they're the kinds of problems that one man, however capable, cannot resolve by himself. Swagger can deal with the specific people who wronged him. He cannot single-handedly fix the kind of systemic corruption that allowed people like them to operate for so long without consequences. And the film is honest about that limitation. This honesty is part of what makes Shooter intellectually respectable, in addition to being genuinely entertaining. It would have been easy and commercially safer to give the audience a completely clean, unambiguous victory that suggests the system ultimately works, and that heroes can fix everything if they're tough and principled enough. Shooter resists that temptation, and in doing so, it says something true about the limits of individual heroism as a solution to systemic problems. Individual courage and capability matter enormously in specific situations, as the film demonstrates. But they're not a substitute for the collective work of building and maintaining institutions that are genuinely accountable and genuinely committed to the values they claim to serve. That's a heavy thought to leave an audience with after an action thriller, but Shooter earns it. Thinking about the film's production from a more practical angle, it's interesting to consider how it was actually put together physically. Fuqua filmed in multiple locations across North America, using British Columbia extensively to stand in for various American environments, a common practice in Hollywood production that takes advantage of favorable economics and a wide variety of available locations and landscape. The Wyoming sequences were shot in ways that capture the genuine majesty of that kind of landscape, and the production design team did excellent work, ensuring that Swagger's mountain home felt authentically lived in, rather than like a movie set dressed to look inhabited. The casting process for a film like this is also worth thinking about. Mark Wahlberg was not the only actor considered for the role of Bob Lee Swagger. There was, as there always is with major studio productions, a period of development during which various actors were attached or considered before the final casting was confirmed. The fact that Wahlberg ultimately got the role and delivered such an effective performance suggests that the casting process worked, that the people making the film identified correctly who could bring the necessary combination of physical credibility, emotional depth, and star power to make the character work on screen. The stunt and technical work on Shooter is also worth acknowledging, because a film that deals so seriously with the mechanics of long-range shooting has an obligation to get the physical details right. And by most accounts, the film's technical advisors, drawn from military and law enforcement backgrounds, were deeply involved in ensuring that what we see on screen reflects real practices and real capabilities as closely as a dramatic narrative allows. This kind of technical authenticity doesn't happen by accident. It requires hiring the right consultants, listening to them, and being willing to adjust the story or the staging when the reality and the desired spectacle come into conflict. That willingness to prioritize authenticity is part of what gives the film its grounded quality. Looking at Shooter alongside other Mark Wahlberg films from a similar period, it's interesting to see how it fits into his overall career trajectory. Wahlberg had proven his action credentials in films like The Italian Job, and later would go on to further franchise success. But Shooter represents something slightly different in his filmography, a more character-driven action film that relies on his ability to convey interior life as much as physical capability. Wahlberg is convincing in the action sequences, obviously, but the moments that stick with you from his performance are the quieter ones, the moments where you see Swagger processing something difficult, making a decision that he knows has a cost, dealing with the reality of a situation that is not what he was told it would be. Those quieter moments are where the performance reveals its real depth, and they're the moments that distinguish Swagger from a more generic action hero. It's also worth mentioning that Shooter came out during a period when the action thriller genre was undergoing a significant evolution. The Jason Bourne films, specifically The Bourne Identity in 2002 and The Bourne Supremacy in 2004, had raised the bar for what intelligent, grounded action filmmaking could look like, and the wider industry was in the process of absorbing those lessons. Casino Royale had just come out in late 2006, reinventing James Bond along similar lines. The genre was moving away from the more fantastic, physics-defying action of the 90s toward a harder, more realistic aesthetic, and Shooter was well positioned to benefit from that shift and to contribute to it. The film's commitment to physical authenticity, its interest in character over spectacle, and its willingness to engage with serious political themes all aligned it with the best of what the genre was doing at that moment. What Shooter also captures very effectively is a sense of how quickly a life can be destabilized by the application of institutional power against an individual. Swagger goes from secure, if isolated, independence to hunted fugitive in a matter of hours, and the film captures that velocity of change in a way that feels genuinely alarming rather than just dramatically convenient. The speed with which official narratives solidify around him, with which resources are mobilized against him, with which doors close, is a reminder of how asymmetric the relationship between individuals and institutions actually is in moments of conflict. This is not a comfortable thought, and Shooter doesn't present it as one. But it's an honest one, and the film's willingness to be honest about it is part of what gives it its edge. There's a moment fairly early in the film's second act where Swagger is watching news coverage of himself on a television in a motel room, hearing his own name and story being described in terms that are completely unrecognizable to him. And Wahlberg plays the scene with a quiet devastation that is one of the most human moments in the entire film. It's not a big, showy, emotional scene. It's just a man watching himself become a stranger in the official story of his own life. And the stillness with which Wahlberg plays it makes it more, rather than less, affecting. That scene, more than any of the action sequences, is the emotional core of what Shooter is about. And the fact that a mainstream action thriller has that kind of emotional core is a significant part of why it remains worth talking about. The film also does something interesting with the concept of home and belonging. Swagger's Wyoming retreat is not just a location, but an idea, a representation of the possibility of standing outside the compromised world of institutional power and simply being a person in a landscape. The conspiracy doesn't just frame him for a crime. It takes that possibility away from him. It forces him back into the world that he had chosen to leave, back into the systems and hierarchies and moral compromises that he had opted out of. His journey through the film is partly about navigating those systems to defeat the specific people who wronged him. But it's also about whether the possibility of genuinely stepping outside those systems is real or illusory. Whether someone with Swagger's background and capabilities can ever truly just be a person in a landscape, or whether the world will always have a claim on him. That question doesn't have a clean answer, and the film doesn't pretend that it does. But the fact that it's asking it gives Shooter a philosophical depth that transcends the genre requirements while still satisfying them, which is exactly the balance that the best genre films strike. We should probably also spend a moment on the film's sense of humor, because we've been pretty serious for a while and Shooter actually has genuine wit running through it that contributes to its texture and watchability. Fuqua has never been known primarily as a comedic director, but he clearly understands the value of tonal variation in maintaining audience engagement over a 2-hour-plus running time. The film never becomes a comedy, but there are moments of genuine levity, often courtesy of Michael Peña's Nick Memphis, that provide necessary breathing room between sequences of higher intensity. These moments work because they feel organic to the characters rather than imposed from outside as mandated commercial release. Nick is genuinely funny sometimes, not because the film needs a laugh at that moment, but because Nick is the kind of person who says funny things, and Peña finds those moments naturally, rather than performing them. Wahlberg also gets occasional moments of dry wit that fit perfectly with Swagger's character. A man who has seen everything and can do everything might reasonably develop a certain laconic humor as a coping mechanism, and the film allows Swagger that quality without overplaying it or letting it undermine the seriousness of his situation. It's a carefully calibrated tonal balance that requires real skill from both the actors and the director, and Shooter manages it well. All right, here's something that we haven't touched on yet that I think is genuinely fascinating from a cultural perspective. Shooter arrived at a very specific moment in American cultural history when the relationship between civilians and military institutions was being renegotiated in real time due to the ongoing conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. The film's central premise, a decorated veteran who is betrayed and used by the institutions that shaped him, tapped directly into anxieties that were widespread in American society at that moment, anxieties about whether the people who were asking veterans to sacrifice were actually worthy of that sacrifice, whether the purposes being served were genuinely the purposes being stated, whether loyalty to country was the same thing as loyalty to the people claiming to speak for the country. These were not abstract philosophical questions in 2007. They were live, urgent, contested questions that a significant portion of the American public was actively wrestling with. Shooter didn't create those anxieties. It didn't manufacture or exaggerate them. It recognized them as a real cultural current and gave them a dramatic embodiment in Bob Lee Swagger and his situation. That's what good popular art does. It identifies what people are already feeling and thinking and worrying about and gives those feelings a shape and a story that allows audiences to engage with them in the emotional context of narrative rather than the anxious context of daily reality. The film's commercial success suggests that it identified something real, that audiences responded to it in ways that went beyond just appreciating a well-made action thriller. This is also why Shooter has aged as well as it has, and why its themes seem, if anything, more rather than less relevant as time goes on. The specific geopolitical context of 2007 has changed, but the underlying questions about institutional accountability, the relationship between military service and political exploitation, the vulnerability of individuals to the narrative power of institutions, these haven't gone away. If anything, in an era of increased skepticism about institutions across the political spectrum and increased awareness of how institutional power can be misused, the film's central concerns feel freshly urgent rather than historically dated. It's worth acknowledging, in the spirit of comprehensive coverage, that Shooter is not a perfect film. We've mentioned some of its limitations already, the occasional logical leap, the slightly underserved secondary characters. But it's worth adding that the film can sometimes feel slightly overlong in its middle section, where the mechanics of the conspiracy are being established in enough detail that you might occasionally feel like the plot is working harder than it needs to. This is the perennial challenge of the conspiracy thriller. You need enough detail to make the conspiracy credible and satisfying when revealed, but too much detail becomes its own kind of burden, and finding that balance is genuinely difficult. Shooter generally manages it, but isn't always flawless in its management. The film also makes some choices in its action choreography that push against its commitment to groundedness in ways that some viewers will notice and some won't. There are moments where Swagger does things that are dramatically satisfying but would be extremely difficult for any real person to accomplish, even someone with Swagger's extraordinary training and experience. Fuqua earns a lot of credit for the film's general commitment to physical honesty, but he's also making a mainstream action film that has certain commercial obligations, and occasionally those obligations express themselves in moments of elevated implausibility. This is a manageable flaw rather than a damning one, but it's part of an honest assessment of what the film is and what it achieves. For fans of the source novel by Stephen Hunter, the film adaptation inevitably involves some simplification and alteration. Hunter's books are extraordinarily detailed, particularly in their technical content, and a significant amount of that detail necessarily gets compressed or eliminated in the process of adaptation. Hunter himself has spoken about the adaptation with a mixture of appreciation for what it got right and acknowledgement of what was necessarily lost in translation. Fans of the novels coming to the film should probably approach it as an inspired interpretation rather than a faithful reproduction. And in those terms, it holds up very well. The film captures the spirit of what makes Swagger compelling as a character, even if it can't replicate the immersive depth that the novels offer. For viewers who are interested in exploring more of the Swagger universe after watching the film, the novel Point of Impact is an excellent place to start. Hunter's prose is engaging, and his technical detail, while sometimes dense, is always in service of character and story rather than existing for its own sake. The book develops Swagger's background, his relationships, and his world in more depth than the film can, and reading it after seeing the film enriches both experiences. The television series, which ran on USA Network, offers yet another interpretation of the Swagger character and world, and while it's a very different beast from the film, it has its own merits and is worth checking out for anyone who wants more of this particular universe. On the subject of what Shooter represents in the broader context of Antoine Fuqua's directorial career, it's interesting to think about the through lines in his work that make it distinctive. Fuqua has consistently been drawn to stories about competence under pressure, about individuals who have developed extraordinary capabilities through discipline and sacrifice, and who are then tested in extreme circumstances. Whether it's Denzel Washington's corrupt but extraordinarily capable detective in Training Day, or Mark Wahlberg's precise and determined sniper in Shooter, or Denzel again as Robert McCall in the Equalizer series, Fuqua's protagonists share a quality of hard-won mastery that makes them compelling to watch even when their moral situations are complicated. He's a director who genuinely admires excellence and communicates that admiration through his camera. Fuqua also has a consistent interest in the ways that institutional systems can corrupt individuals or fail them, and in what it looks like when people with strong personal codes operate within or against institutional constraints. Training Day is all about how an institution can socialize someone into profound moral compromise. Shooter is about how an institution can betray someone who has given it his best. The Equalizer is about someone who has stepped entirely outside institutional constraint to operate by a purely personal moral code. These are different explorations of the same underlying question, and tracking that question through Fuqua's work reveals a filmmaker with genuine thematic preoccupations rather than just a technically skilled commercial director. The film's production design deserves a specific shout-out that we haven't fully given it yet. The environments in Shooter feel inhabited and real in ways that a lot of action films don't quite manage. The attention to detail in Swagger's mountain home, in the various safe houses and temporary shelters he occupies during his time on the run, in the official spaces that represent institutional power, all of this contributes to the film's sense of a real world with real textures and real history. Production design is one of those invisible crafts when it's done well, contributing enormously to a film's believability without drawing attention to itself. Shooter's production design is done very well indeed. The costume design works similarly. Swagger's wardrobe throughout the film communicates character information efficiently and economically. The practical, functional clothing of the wilderness sequences gives way to different kinds of practicality as he moves through different environments on the run, always choosing function over appearance, always looking like someone who has thought carefully about what he needs rather than how he looks. This is exactly right for the character, and the costume designer clearly worked closely with the director and with Wahlberg to ensure that what Swagger wears at each point in the film tells us something true about where he is and what he's dealing with. Hair and makeup in action films might seem like a trivial thing to mention, but in Shooter, they actually do meaningful work. Swagger's physical appearance changes through the film in ways that reflect what he's been through, and the progressive signs of stress and hardship that appear in Wahlberg's look as the film goes on contribute to the sense of a man being tested rather than a superhero breezing through challenges. These are small details, but they accumulate into a coherent physical portrait of a character under genuine pressure, and they're the result of careful collaboration between departments that don't always get acknowledged in discussions of a film's achievements. At this point, we've been talking about Shooter for quite a while, and we've covered an enormous amount of ground. From the basic premise to the deep thematic content, from the performances to the production craft, from the political context to the legacy and the cultural conversation around the film. And you know what's interesting? We could probably keep going. That's actually a sign of a film with real substance. There's more to say about it than a single conversation can contain, more angles from which to approach it, more details to notice and discuss. Not every film rewards that kind of extended attention, but Shooter does. What we hope, if you've come this far with us, is that you leave this conversation with either a renewed appreciation for a film you already loved or a genuine curiosity to seek it out if you haven't seen it yet. Shooter is the kind of film that the action thriller genre produces at its best, which is not as often as we might like. It's smart without being pretentious, exciting without being empty, politically engaged without being preachy, and consistently performed and directed at a level that reflects genuine craft and care. Those qualities together are rarer than they should be, and when they come together as well as they do in Shooter, it's worth celebrating. The lasting image that Shooter leaves you with is of a man who refused to accept a false version of himself, who fought through enormous opposition to insist on the truth of his own story, and who came out the other side of that fight having paid a real price but having preserved something essential about who he is. That's a story that resonates beyond any specific political moment or genre convention, and it's why Shooter is still being watched and discussed and appreciated nearly 2 decades after it first appeared. Good films have a way of staying in the conversation, of continuing to reveal themselves to new audiences in new contexts, and this is one of them. Thanks so much for spending this time with us going through every layer of this incredible movie. If shooter is already in your regular rotation, hopefully we've given you some new things to think about next time you revisit it. And if this conversation has inspired you to finally sit down and watch it for the first time, then honestly, that's the best possible outcome we could hope for. Either way, we appreciate you being here, and we genuinely love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What does shooter mean to you? What did we miss? What do you want us to break down next? Let us know, because this channel exists for exactly these kinds of conversations, and we are never tired of having them. If shooter is already in your regular rotation, hopefully we've given you some new things to think about next time you revisit it. And if this conversation has inspired you to finally sit down and watch it for the first time, then honestly, that's the best possible outcome we could hope for. Either way, we appreciate you being here, and we genuinely love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What does shooter mean to you? What did we miss? What do you want us to break down next? Let us know, because this channel exists for exactly these kinds of conversations, and we are never tired of having them.